negócio vai passar.
Bom, boa tarde, gente. Estamos chegando aqui à nossa última mesa do dia, né? Uma mesa intitulada Novel and Reality, Epistemological Transformations of Literary, que é parte da programação da terceira jornada de estudos sobre Henry James e do primeiro simpósio de estudos sobre realismo e modernismo. Eu, de novo, agradeço, em primeiro lugar, ao Núcleo de Pesquisa de Estudos sobre Henry James, né, que está organizando essa jornada e o simpósio, né, mas agradeço também pelo apoio da CAPES e pelo apoio do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada aqui da USP e ao Departamento de Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada da FEFELESH. E agora eu tenho o grande prazer de apresentar os palestrantes que compõem essa mesa, né, o João de Azevedo e Dias Duarte, que é professor no Departamento de História da PUC. Ele escreveu o livro Progresso do Peregrino, Religião e Política na Gênese do Iluminismo Inglês. O João vem estudando já há algum tempo as relações entre iluminismo e religião, né, e iluminismo e o romance, e também entre iluminismo e ficção. E hoje, né, o João vai falar sobre, enfim, proferir a palestra intitulada Enlightenment, Realism and the Novel. E aqui à minha esquerda está a Natasha, né, Vicente da Costa, que é professora da Universidade Federal de Jataí, né, doutora em estudos literários pela Unifesp, com a tese A Linguagem do Espaço em Henry James, a Fase Madura. Né? E, sobretudo, mais importante, ela coordena atualmente o grupo de pesquisa Núcleo de Estudos Henry James, né, que é um grupo registrado no diretório do CNPq, e do qual eu tenho muito orgulho de fazer parte. E os interesses de pesquisa da Natasha são principalmente a literatura estadunidense e o ensino da literatura. Então, dito isso, eu vou passar, né, aos palestrantes. João, muito obrigada. A palavra está com você.
Okay. This paper is part of my current postdoctoral research, by the way, supervised by Professor Cass, which deals with the relationship between the Enlightenment and the novel. I'll start with a disclaimer here. This is not a final research result, but some stuff I've been musing upon recently, and I hope you'll help me to think through the implications of it. I take the opportunity of this symposium to reflect on realism, often understood in its literary specification as a distinctive characteristic of the novel. What interests me here is the connection between the Enlightenment, realism, and the novel. One way to begin to answer it would be deductively by defining each of these concepts. Instead of proceeding this way, I would like to consider the central thesis of Ian Watt's The Rise of the Novel, because it articulates a particularly influential response in literary history to the problem that concerns me. It is true that enlightenment is not a category employed by Watt. I have been unable to find any use of the term in The Rise of the Novel. On the other hand, the term Renaissance and the adjective modern, as in modern times or modern society, are used frequently, and in a way that indicates a historical periodization marked by a profound rupture in European culture, a rupture that, beginning in the 16th century, finds its culmination in the 18th. Indeed, Ian Watt speaks of a larger historical change, that vast transformation of Western civilization since the Renaissance, which has replaced the unified world picture of the Middle Ages with another very different one which presents us essentially with a developing but unplain aggregate of particular individuals having particular experiences at particular times and at particular places. The defining characteristic of the new worldview of modern times is individualism, by which Watt means a whole society mainly governed by the idea of every individual's intrinsic independence, both from other individuals and from that multifarious allegiance to past modes of thought and action, denoted by the word tradition. Individualism, characteristic of modernity, manifests itself in an analogous form, that is, as realism, both in modern philosophy and literature. Deliberately departing from the more established views in the history of philosophy, Watt defines philosophical realism as a modern tendency to invert the old epistemological hierarchy between universals and particulars in favor of the latter, privileging in the realm of knowledge sensory perception over rational intuition. Interesting, Watt gives prominence to Descartes in this process, although it is clear from the subsequent discussion that it is the British empiricists, from Francis Bacon to David Hume, who are the protagonists of this story. He says, the general temper of philosophical realism has been critical, anti-traditional, and innovating. Its method has been the study of the particulars of experience by the individual investigator, who, ideally at least, is free from the body of past assumptions and traditional beliefs. In an analogous way, and Watt insists that the connection between the two is neither one of identity nor causality, literary realism, which is configured in the new emerging genre, the novel, shares the temperament, methods, and purpose of its philosophical counterpart, namely, to produce, and I quote, Watt, an authentic account of the actual experiences of individuals. To this end, the novel adopts a set of procedures or narrative conventions that, although not completely absent in earlier fiction, were rarely and unsystematically employed there. Watt calls the set, which includes the adoption of original plots, the particularized representation of characters, their environment, and the flow of time, and the predominantly referential use of language, he calls it formal realism, as is well known. And he defines it as the sum of literary techniques whereby the novel imitation of human life follows the procedures adopted by philosophical realism in its attempt to ascertain and report the truth. We can conclude from that, that Watt, two things. First one, that Watt assumed the rise of empiricism is connected to the rise of the novel as an analogous manifestation of the modern individualist worldview. And two, in this way, the novel participates in its own way in the philosophical enterprise of producing and transmitting knowledge about the observable world through narratives in which referential language prevails over figurative, poetic language. As a commentator has summarized it recently, it is as if the realist novel was therefore an agent of the Enlightenment for Watt. Despite all the criticisms and corrections to which the rise of the novel has been subjected since its publication, I do not believe that these two theses have been discarded by subsequent literary historiography on the subject. In what follows, I would like to briefly consider another view of the problem from a position extrinsic to this Anglo-American historiographical tradition. In 1964, therefore 7 years after the publication of Watt's The Rise of the Novel, the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg published an essay in a collection of texts by the famous group Poetic and Hermeneutic, of which Blumenberg was a member. The text was entitled The Concept of Reality and the Possibility of the Novel, Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Möglichkeit des Romans. Although the novel is not a prominent theme in Blumenberg's vast and varied work, this particular essay offers some interesting insights into the problem that concerns me here. The essay is initially presented as a commentary on the classical topos that poets are liars and its antithesis, that is, that poets speak the truth. This gives rise to a consideration of different historical ways of conceiving the relationship between the work of art, reality, and truth. Blumenberg says, at no time in the history of Western aesthetic theory has there been any serious departure from the tendency to legitimize the work of art in terms of its relation to reality. So any critical assessment of the foundation of traditional aesthetics must begin with a clarification of what is meant by reality. Blumenberg distinguishes 4 historical concepts of reality, making it clear that this distinction is typical schematic and not diachronical linear. The first concept of reality he speaks about, the one that prevailed during classical antiquity, is called by Blumenberg reality of instantaneous evidence. Underlying the Platonic doctrine of ideas, but not identical to it, the classical concept of reality as instantaneous evidence presupposes that reality presents itself and that its presence is sufficient to dispel any doubt, or illusion, or controversy about it. This is the first concept of reality he talks about. The second concept of reality, which was dominant during the Middle Ages, is that of guaranteed reality. In it, there's no longer instantaneous self-evidence of reality as in antiquity. The reality of the world, its reliability, the guarantee that it is not merely a mere illusion, is the existence of a third term which mediates between the world and human reason, that is, God. So the second concept of reality presupposes the existence of God which mediates between the world and the humans. Interestingly, according to Blumenberg, it was the radicalization of the notion of divine omnipotence in the late Middle Ages and the consequent emphasis on the contingency of the world that led to the emergence of a third concept of reality, the one that takes over during modernity. Blumenberg refers to this third concept in different ways, such as the actualization of a context in itself, reality as intersubjective context, or reality as a phenomenal and immanent consistency. But the decisive thing here is that reality no longer presents itself as either self-evident nor dependent on divine will, but rather phenomenologically as the continuous experience of a consistent and coherent world. And I quote, reality can no longer be considered an inherent quality of an object, but is the embodiment of a consistently applied syntax of elements. Reality presents itself now as ever before as a sort of text, which takes on its particular form by obeying certain rules of internal consistency. Reality is for modern times a context. Here, a temporal component and an openness are introduced that are absent in the previous concepts, as reality becomes the result of the process of an actualization of a progressive certainty which never becomes complete, since it is always possible that the future will present new elements that undo the previous consistency. As he says, as Blumenberg says, and I quote, unreality now threatens any reality as an irrevocable reservation, just as even the longest chain of inductive verification is theoretically exposed to the ever-present possibility of falsification. There's also a fourth and final concept of reality that, if I have understood it correctly, seems to be a kind of counterpoint to the concept of immanent consistency. It is reality as resistance, as that which cannot be mastered by the self, revealing itself only through experiences that break through the consistency of the consciousness of reality, such as paradox, contradiction, and absurdity. According to Blumenberg, the way of understanding the work of art varies according to the historical concept of reality. So, the theory of imitation, mimesis, for example, is based on the classical concept of reality as instantaneous evidence. Thus, mimesis brings with it two ontological premises. The first one is the existence of an exemplary self-evident reality, whether given or presupposed. And the second premise is the completeness of this reality with respect to all possible contents and forms of reality. So from this perspective, there can be no spontaneous creation. Nothing new can be added to the world. The cosmos is complete, and all that human activity can do is repeat what already is. Art must copy nature, as the classical topos says. The same is also true within the medieval concept of reality as guaranteed by God. The idea that man could create something not foreseen in divine creation, thus competing with God and his creative power, would be unthinkable. It is only with the emergence in modernity of the third concept of reality's immanent consistency, that human artifice acquires, so to speak, metaphysical dignity. Nature, or the given, gradually loses its authoritative character, and human creation asserts its autonomy in relation to past exemplarity. Here, therefore, is a condition of ontological possibility of the novel. The concept of reality of the open context legitimizes the aesthetic quality of the novitas, novelty, the element of surprise and unfamiliarity, whereas guaranteed reality does not allow anything new or unfamiliar to become real, ascribes to tradition and authority a world that is already mastered and rounded off as the sum total of all that is knowable, and so leads inevitably to the postulate of nihil novum dicere, to say nothing new. On this point, one can say that there is agreement between Blumenberg and Watt and between other theorists of the novel, such as Lukács and Bakhtin. Both see the novel as the quintessentially modern genre. The difference between the two seems to lie in the way they conceive of the novel and its relationship with modern epistemology and experimental science. It is true that for Blumenberg, modern sciences share the same ontological foundation as a novel in the concept of reality as immanent consistency, since it is necessary for nature, or the given, to lose its quality as a model so that the experiment can reconstruct it from the perspective of human interest and according to laws and principles of its own creation. In this sense, both science and art are manifestations of human creative power, of its autonomy and freedom in relation to the given. However, the analogy seems to end there, insofar as the theoretical attitude of the scientist is fundamentally aimed at controlling the unexpected, the possibility of a consistency break, and therefore of unreality. Art, in turn, and the novel in particular, maintains an ambiguous and ironic relationship to the principle of immanent consistency inherent to the third concept of reality. The novel, says Blumenberg, makes a new claim of art. Its claim not merely to represent objects of the world or even to imitate the world, but to actualize a world. A world, nothing less, is the theme and postulate of the novel. So, for Blumenberg, what the novel does is not to imitate the real world, but to create a secondary, imaginary world which imitates the reality of the real, that is, the fact of being real. It thus creates another reality, which as such also is submitted to the principle of internal consistency. However, because it is artificial and provisional, that is finite, this imaginary world is incapable of reproducing the open-endedness of physical experience. So from its beginnings in the 18th century, the novel takes its own possibility as its theme, exploring the incongruity between the imaginary reality of a context and the reality of the existing world, that is, between fiction and reality. To return to the initial problem, I believe it is possible to say that from Blumenberg, the Enlightenment is the moment of affirmation of the concept of reality as an immanent context as a condition of possibility for the rise of the novel. The novel, in turn, fulfills the Enlightenment purpose of affirming human autonomy and freedom, just like experimental science. However, Instead of doing so like science through mastery of a given reality, the novel does so through fiction, which by creating other realities problematizes effective existing reality and expands the sphere of the humanly possible. To conclude, I would like to briefly consider the theory of the novel articulated by Henry Fielding in two of his novels, Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones. Fielding's theory, if not the first, certainly the most profound reflection of the modern novel in the 18th century, offers a more concrete perspective on our problem. What is perhaps most striking about Fielding's theory of the novel is his ambivalence between innovation and tradition, his effort to balance distinct and conflicting demands. On the one hand, Fielding asserts the originality of the novel. It is, he says, a kind of writing which I do not remember having seen hitherto attempted in our language. He also claims for his new province of writing the authority of experience and observation, echoing the modern empiricist epistemological turn and the primacy of experience. He says, scarce a character or action is produced which I have not taken from my observations and experiences. On the other hand, Fielding tries to provide a respectable genealogy to the novel, linking it to literary genres of recognized classical pedigree, such as epic, biography, and history, and resorts to the classical topos of art as an imitation of an eternal and immutable nature, capable of offering timeless, pragmatic moral lessons. More surprising, perhaps, is the fact that Fielding asserts for the novel a claim to historical truth, at the same time as he affirms its fictionality. In the introduction to Book 3 of Joseph Andrews, Fielding polemizes with his contemporary historians and claims for the novel an epistemic primacy over conventional history. He says, "Is not such a book as that which records the achievements of the renowned Don Quixote more worthy of the name of history than even Juan de Mariana's Historiae de Rebus Hispaniae? For whereas the later is confined to a particular period of time and to a particular nation, the former is the history of the world in general." Echoing, and at the same time transforming the famous Aristotelian distinction between poetry and history, Fielding attributes to the novel a historical epistemic superiority over conventional history. While the historian is limited in his narrative to contingency, a particular period of time in a particular nation, the novelist deals with more general truth, without, however, abandoning his grounding in experience. Although drawn from the observation of real life, his characters are not particular existing individuals, but rather fictitious generalizations obtained by induction. I believe, he says, I might aver that I have read little more than I have seen. The lawyer is not only alive, but has been so this 4,000 years. He has not indeed confined himself to one profession, one religion, or one country, but when the first mean, selfish creature appeared on the human stage, who made self the center of the whole creation, then was our lawyer born. And will such a person as I have described exist on earth, so long shall he remain upon it. It is therefore doing him little honor to imagine he endeavors to mimic some little obscure fellow, because he happens to resemble him in one particular feature, or perhaps in his profession. But what guarantees the veracity and authenticity, and therefore the cognitive moral efficacy of the human types represented by the novel, is ultimately the artifice of the writer, what Fielding calls the author's cookery. For Fielding, therefore, there is no true story without artifice. Copying nature is not a neutral procedure of reproducing a pre-existing original. While it is based on experience, the realist novel, as a created artifact, that is, as fiction, presupposes a literary treatment that remodels this prior knowledge into artistic materials and forms that represent exceptionally intelligible models of life. What emerges from this comparison is a multidimensional picture of the novel as a genre, structurally and epistemologically entangled with the Enlightenment. while what situates the novel within the rise of empiricism and the epistemological shift toward particularity, Blumenberg reveals the ontological conditions that make such a genre possible in the first place, namely the transformation of reality into an open context. Fielding finally brings this abstract architecture into contact with the concrete poetics of the novel, acknowledging both its dependence on empirical observation and its claim to general truth, a truth, although made possible only through fiction. Together, this perspective suggests that the novel is not merely a reflection of the Enlightenment, nor simply its literary outgrowth, but one of its most powerful experiments, a form that explores, dramatizes, and ultimately questions existence and reality. Realism, then, is not a transparent window onto the world, but a method of world-making, one that discloses the contingent, constructed nature of reality itself. In this sense, the novel does not just represent modernity, it actively participates in its creation, problematization, and ongoing reimagination. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, João. You made Blumenberg a little easier for me. Not much easier, but a little easier. So now, Natasha. Natasha's lecture is Beyond Bakhtin, Henry James and the Dilemmas of the Chronotope in Modernist Fiction. So, Natasha. Okay. Natasha vai colocar o slide dela.
So thank you, Luisa, for mediating this session and for your kind introductions. It has been a pleasure to organize this wonderful James Conference along with you and Professor Marcelo Pen. Good afternoon, João, my roundtable colleague, and good afternoon to all of you here. Thank you for your presence. Today, my talk will discuss a study that I have been conducting to identify James's chronotopes, to try to understand the workings of his chronotopes in the later novels. So I will be sharing a part of this study today. The concept of the chronotope was developed by Mikhail Bakhtin in the 1930s. And it has become a crucial tool for understanding the relationship between time and space in literature. The chronotope means the fusion of time and space. Time becomes visible in space, such as in the peeling paint or a crack in an old wall. Space penetrates the movement of time, such as in the winding streets that shape how people move and pause. For Bakhtin, time and space are inseparable from the modes of human experience that they make possible. The chronotope is essentially tied to a particular image of a human being and involves, to varying degrees, agency as well as limitations or conditions. For instance, the chronotope of Washington Square in the mid-19th century reveals much about the limitations and possibilities of Catherine Sloper's autonomy. So what can she do in her own time and space? In other words, to understand how the reality of time and space is assimilated in literature also means uncovering the potentials of human experience. And to address how these dynamics take shape in fiction, Bakhtin proposes two distinct modalities of the chronotope, the abstract and the concrete. The abstract chronotope means a non-linear and reversible sense of time, and a generic, interchangeable sense of space. Time does not follow a causal sequence, and events can repeat or regress without lasting consequences. Space lacks specificity and can be relocated without altering the narrative. In this abstract chronotope, the human being is passive and lacks agency, and their lives are shaped by fate, chance, and non-human forces. A key example given by Bakhtin is the 2nd century Greek novel Leucippe and Clitophon by Achilles Statius. In this novel, storms and shipwrecks are resolved by divine intervention, and time passes without real transformation. By contrast, the concrete chronotope portrays a linear and irreversible experience of time, in which the events unfold causally and lead to permanent consequences. Time is grounded in historical reality and shaped by individual actions. Space is specific and geographical. Unlike the abstract space, the concrete space cannot be relocated without losing meaning. It actively influences the narrative. In the concrete chronotope, the characters possess agency, and their lives are shaped by their choices, actions, and the specific context in which they live. And I see a relation here with João's talk. A key example is the 16th century work Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais. It reflects a labor-focused worldview. Time follows an irreversible agricultural cycle of nature and emphasizes communal life. So, according to Bakhtin, the assimilation of reality in literature oscillates among profoundly different phenomena, reflecting different degrees of abstraction and concreteness. And this assimilation for Bakhtin reached its height in the 19th century. It is in the realist novel that this process is most fully realized. Time and space are precisely determined. Causally governs events, and characters possess individualized consciousness. In Balzac's Père-Goriot, the boarding house setting and the post-Napoleonic Paris shape the character's fate. Rastignac's social ascent reflects a time of real historical transformation, with concrete decisions rooted in a spatial and temporal dimension that has material consequences. So, Bakhtin's formulation, however, contudo, todavia, entretanto, porém, however, raises a critical question. How can we analyze the construction of reality and the image of human being in literary works that precisely challenge these conventions, such as those of modernist fiction? And what is James's role in this, of course? The 19th and 20th centuries, that are central stages for realist and modernist fiction, entertain different assumptions. In the 19th century, chronological time had major implications for modern historiography, according to George Eggers and Siegfried Krakauer. The notion of time was unilinear, based on continuity and direction, and the date of an event was highly significant. With the advent of railways, telegraphs, and factories, standardized time emerged, replacing local references with a collective organization of time. In geography, this 19th century, spatial orientation was fundamental to its consolidation as a scientific discipline. As Paul Claval and Paulo Gomes point out, geography sought to describe, classify, and represent territories, conceiving space as something measurable and objective. This approach made it possible to map colonies, delineate borders, explore resources, and contribute to the construction of national identities. So all these assumptions from history and geography underpin the notion of a concrete chronotope with irreversible time and non-transferable space. This is the foundation, for example, of the Golden Bowl. On Bond Street, Amerigo, I will say Amerigo, evokes an explicitly geopolitical theme, the replacement of the Roman Empire by the British Empire. Amerigo, he was one of the modern Romans who find by the Thames a more convincing image of the truth of the ancient state than any they have left by the Tiber. So it shows the decline of autocratic regimes and the rise of new imperial powers. And then Amerigo observes a shop window on Bond Street and the variety of objects on display. Objects massive and lumpish in silver and gold in the forms to which precious stones contribute, or in leather, steel, brass, applied to 100 uses and abuses, were assembled together as if in the insolence of the empire they had been the loot of far-off victories. We can see that the shop window on Bond Street materializes imperialist historical time in British geographical space. The display window symbolizes the fruits of colonial conquests and capitalist accumulation, showcasing the spoils of power. It functions as a kind of visual archive of an empire, suggesting through precious metals and jewels the violence of extraction and domination. This is explicitly a concrete chronotope. The historical time of empires is inscribed in the urban geographical space. Even language itself supports the concrete chronotope. During this walk, Amerigo recalls a conversation with Maggie. The past perfect tense records the remote past of the dialogue, and the simple past marks the present of Amerigo's walk, as is commonly expected. For instance, and I have highlighted the verb tenses. He had sounded sullen even to himself, but she had taken it gaily. So we have the temporal markers of the distant past. The prince hadn't been annoyed at this, but had been positive. The young man remembered even now how extraordinarily clear, he couldn't think of anything else, she had looked in her prettiness as she had said it. So these verbal distinctions clearly mark the transition between chronotopes and materializes linguistically the concrete structure. In other words, time is obviously chronological and space is specific. Amerigo's walk could not take place without harming the plot in a Russian village. However, the abstract chronotope is also present in this narrative, juxtaposed with the concrete. There is, for instance, ambiguity surrounding this past dialogue between the couple. The time and space of this dialogue are undefined and sustain an atmosphere of generalization that characterizes the abstract chronotope. The reader does not know exactly when this dialogue took place. And based on the contextual information, it is assumed that the dialogue occurred in London. But in the same chapter, there are references to dialogues that took place in Rome and Paris. So the chronotopic signs are imprecise. Furthermore, language also brings forth the abstract chronotope, even more. There are moments in the Golden Bowl when the past perfect and the simple past, they are used interchangeably. This is a process of presentification of the past and preterization of the present. As William James argues, in the pulse of inner life, the present contains a bit of the past, a bit of the future, and all of the real units of experience overlap. Some examples of the linguistically abstract chronotope are the following. The prince's answer to such remarks, genial, charming, like every answer the parties to this new arrangement had yet had from him, was that he was practicing his American in order to converse properly on equal terms, as it were, with Mr. Verver. So this situation here describes a distant past, and the verb form was is used instead of had been. He had perceived on the spot that any serious discussion of veracity, of loyalty, of rather of the want of them, practically took her unprepared, as if it were quite new to her. Here, the use of took and were, instead of had taken and had been, also blends the temporal planes. This is a pattern that runs throughout the novel. When Amerigo and Charlotte are in Matcham, there is a curious temporal inversion, with which she detached a rich white rosebud from its company with another in the front of her dress and flung it down to him. He caught it in its fall, fixing her again after she had watched him place it in his buttonhole. Here, the past perfect had watched stands out from the simple past pattern. It describes Charlotte's observation as if she had already seen Amerigo place the flower on his lapel even before he had grabbed the rose. So it doesn't make sense chronologically. James employs a time that is simultaneously chronological and disordered, a space that is both specific and imprecise. And this is what I call the Jamesian dual chronotope, a simultaneous affiliation to two opposing regimes of apprehending reality, which is realized in the very chronotopic language itself. But why does James employ the abstract chronotope? History and geography are already known. There are sufficient material conditions for the full apprehension of reality. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world is no longer a discontinuous and shattered sliver of time and space, as Bakhtin describes antiquity. Because now, in the 20th century, cities, social organizations, the dimensions of the globe, the continents, and geology, they are well known. So I want to argue that James's adoption of a dual chronotope does not describe different levels of comprehension of objective reality. His dual chronotope is the fictionalization of the ambivalent nature of modern subjectivity. Amerigo's reflection, for example, reveal his ambivalent feelings. He recognizes the success of having secured a financially advantageous marriage, but one that harms his individual freedom. James incorporates into the form of the novel the new conceptions of time and space emerging on the horizon, while keeping a look at what had already happened. According to historian Marlon Salomon, historiography begins to understand time as multiple, with various overlapping layers, dimensions, and rhythms. Geographer Edward Ralph coined the term placelessness to describe the uniformization of landscape and the weakening of place identity. All of this is latent in James's works. And just as James follows in Balzac's footsteps, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce following James's footsteps. At the beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, the present of the narrative is mixed with a distant past, with a reminiscence of an 18-year-old Clarissa Dalloway who opened the windows at the French country house and stepped out into the morning air. And Mrs. Dalloway's walk on Bond Street is quite reminiscent of that of Amerigo, or of Schroeder walking around in Paris. Here's a citation from Mrs. Dalloway. Did it matter then? It has 3 parts. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street. Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? But that, somehow, in the streets of London, on the web and flow of things, here, there, she survived. Peter survived, lived in each other. She being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was. Part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches, as she had seen the trees lift the mist. But it spread ever so far, her life herself. Here, compared to James, the chronotope moves with more frequent back and forth shifts between layers of the present, the recent past, and the distant past. The chronotopic movement that James expands over more textual space, Woolf compresses into a single paragraph. Bond Street here condenses the historical time of post-war London, bringing personal memories, traumas, awareness of death, and the flow of social life. In Ulysses, the Wandering Rocks episode presents the most complex chronotope structure. This episode is broken up into 19 short vignettes that have interlocking moments. They overlap and create a view of urban life that is at the same time connected and disconnected. As our friend Paul Armstrong argues, there is a temporal paradox in modern fiction. Time and individual experience are coordinated and develop side by side, but we never fully access the moment lived by another. There is an intersubjective intertwining of separate worlds, as Armstrong argues. In the first episode of Wandering Rocks, Father Comey walks from his church to Artane. At the end of the section, he sees a young couple emerging from a hedge. A flushed young man came from a gap of a hedge, and after him came a young woman with wild nodding daisies in her hand. The young man raised his hat abruptly. The young woman abruptly bent, and with slow care detached from her light skirt a clinging twig. Father Conmee blessed both gravely and turned a thin page of his breviary. Then in episode 8, this is the first episode, then in episode 8, the same event is described. The young woman with slow care detached from her light skirt a clinging twig. So vignettes 1 and 8 happen nearly 5 miles apart. But the event of the woman cleaning her skirt happens at the same time in both sections. So in summary, while Balzac helped assimilate the concrete chronotope fully into fiction, James helped to break it, to make it structurally dual and point the way to a new chronotopic regime. Woolf, Joyce, and other modernists further dismantled the chronotope, making it virtually anti-chronotopic. Time and space are stripped of their role of organizing and anchoring narrative reality. They become less indicators of external events and more expressions of internal states. The modernist chronotope describes, in its literary form, the emotional impact of history and geography on the individual, the impact of imperialism, the costs of voluntary submission, the traumas of war, urban connection and disconnection. Thank you.
very much, Natasha. It's very thought-provoking, and I told you before, I want to talk more with you because I think our works have a connection. So I will open to the audience, but before I will... Break the ice. Yeah, break the ice. So, João, wow, it was difficult because Blumenberg is difficult, so, but it was very, very interesting. And I know already that for you, the novel as a genre has an elective affinity to Enlightenment. Both of them are reflective, are critical of the present time. I heard you talking about that before. And I'd like to know if realism, as linked to this third concept of reality, Blumenberg, third concept of reality, also share this critical attitude. If you think it's also share this critical attitude. And to Natasha, wow, I'm still processing, but do you think that this dual chronotope, this Jamesian dual chronotope, the mixture of this concrete and I would say historicist chronotope with the abstract one that you found in the Golden Bowl, if this mixture points out to the crisis of the historicist's linear teleological time, the time that leaves the past behind and opens to the future. If this mixture, this dual chronotope of James, the Golden Bowl, is the way he figures this crisis in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. That's it.
Okay, Luisa, thank you for your question. You asked if realism, as Blumenberg conceives it, is marked by a critical attitude. I would say that potentially yes, in the sense that the realist novel, by creating an imaginary secondary world, ends up putting into perspective existing reality. So it's potentially critical. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Luisa, for your great question. Yes, I think that James's chronotope and how he materializes it with his verb tenses, syntax, vocabulary, I think that they all point to this very crucial, critical moment in history and geography. So when you mentioned the crisis of historicism, exactly, because in my longer version, I explored this a little bit further of how James's later, especially later works, mark the fall of Victorian. There is one critic who mentions specifically Victorian historicism. And just to complement this view, in geography as well, there are many crises exactly at the end of the 19th century. And they relate to national identities as well, to the beginning of globalization, as we can see that in James as well. But, and also how geography goes beyond a setting, and how it influences people and how people can influence space. So I think that there is a great combination of history and geography that marks crisis in those scientific disciplines. And I think that we can see that in James's chronotopic language. So I agree. thank you for your question.
Do you want to make some questions, Paul? Could you bring it to Paul, please?
So very, very provocative papers. They make me want to go back and reread Blumenberg, whom I have not read for a number of years. I've always struggled with Bakhtin's notion of the chronotype, so you've helped me, but I still have more questions. I don't know that the questions really relate to each other, but I'll ask them both, and then you can respond individually. And I apologize in advance because they're speculative questions, wondering about how you're talking in each case about things relate to contexts that I've wondered about that I think are also relevant to your topics. First, João, you talked about, interestingly, starting with Ian Watt and the rise of the novel, and Blumenberg's notions of reality and modernity, connecting the rise of the novel and Blumenberg's notion of realism and modernity, defined in the particular way you defined it. As you may know, or maybe not, there's no reason why you should, Watt went on after realism in the novel to write about Joseph Conrad. Conrad in the 19th century. He was going to write actually 2 volumes, Conrad in the 19th century, Conrad in the 20th century, and University of California Press, knowing how long it took him to write Rise of the Novel, said no, not going to have 2 volumes on Conrad, we'll just have one Conrad in the 19th century. But it's Conrad in the 19th century that's looking to the modernity in a different sense than Blumenberg is thinking about it. And one of the most interesting chapters in the Conrad biography is where he talks about the impression and the Conrad's famous preface to his unfortunately named The Nigger of the Narcissus, where he talks about how, and I just Googled it, my task which I'm trying to achieve is by the power of the written word, Conrad writes, to make you hear, to make you feel, it is above all to make you see. And he goes on and talks more about that. The preface is full of all sorts of contradictions that I wonder whether Blumenberg's 4 concepts of reality would help to articulate. But I also wonder, and again, so this is unfair because I don't ask you to know this preface or know Conrad's biography of Conrad, but it may be of interest to you as you work further on this project. But I'm wondering whether Conrad, as a figure that's sort of introducing modernity in a different sense, the 20th century and the 21st century, the way in which he is playing with these different concepts of reality in the preface, and the way that Watt moves from Rise in the Novel to the biography, whether there's something there that you could work with that would complicate the history of modernity and the history of the novel that you're working on. Just some thoughts. The question I wanted to ask you, Natasha, I mentioned this briefly in our side conversation. Fascinating the way you use Bakhtin's notion of the abstract chronotope. As you know, in Stories of the Brain, when I talk, you quoted, I talk there about Joseph Frank's classic essay, Spatial Form in Modern Literature. And I was really wondering, how your reconfiguration of the chronotope would enter into the debate about Frank's notion of spatial form. It's a complicated debate, but it seems to me that your notion of the abstract chronotope as the type of modernity might make spatial form less ambiguous or less paradoxical than he makes it seem to be, or maybe not, I don't know. Because he, as you remember, Frank is using Lessing's notion of Lawakun, who says that in narrative temporal art, it should be one thing after another, sequential, whereas in the visual arts, its representation is simultaneous. And he says that the problem with the modern novel is that it turns this upside down. You're suggesting that maybe those 2 possibilities are already within the novel, as I understand it, and that maybe spatial form is not as transgressive or as impossible as Frank makes it seem to be. I don't know. I just really wonder how your use of Bakhtin would inform, complicate, or be informed and complicated by the Joseph Frank spatial form debate. Again, apologies because it's a question about something that you didn't talk about, but something that I think would be relevant to your project if you develop it further. So.
Thank you, Paul, for your question. I know that Watt wrote about Conrad. I haven't read it, though. But your question raises the problem of the relation between the third concept and the fourth concept of reality in Blumenberg. I mentioned just in passing that there's a fourth concept for Blumenberg, which is, if I understand it correctly, I'm really not sure if I did, would be a counterpoint to the concept of reality as internal or immanent consistency, in the sense of the possibility that the real would be something beyond.
Right, interesting. And in Conrad, in the Conrad in the 19th century, Watt's chapter on impressionism connects impressionism to symbolism, and it stresses the ambiguity of the phrase in the preface to make you see, thinking that Conrad is playing with an impressionistic notion of wanting you to be visualizing, and a symbolist notion of wanting, Valerly's notion of seeing beyond. So in some sense, I think you're really onto something. Those two notions of reality are playing for Watt in the ambiguity of that term, what seeing means, what vision means.
Interesting. I think the fourth concept of reality, Blumenberg's fourth concept of reality, relates somehow to modernist fiction. It's not clear from he mentions surrealism, and the experiments with the absurdity and things like that. He talks about Kafka also, paradox and things like that. But I think this fourth concept would prompt another kind of realism that is less concerned with creating a consistent world than revealing something that is somehow underneath or beyond the consistency created by consciousness.
So the impressionism symbolism opposition would be relevant to that.
But I'm just speculating. I'm not sure what he was really thinking
about. Thank you, Professor Armstrong, for your question. It's a great question because I read Joseph Frank's book for my thesis some time ago, and I think it's a great work. I really enjoyed reading it. And I think that your question makes much sense because they are talking about similar things but different things. They are talking about different things because when I read the spatial form, I thought that it would talk about the description of space or the representation of space in fiction, because that was what I was looking for. But he doesn't talk about this precisely. He talks about how we have repetition of words or scenes or of expressions that create connections throughout the novel. And he mentions Marcel Proust and other writers. But how a novel has this capacity of linking together and interlocking, as that's a word that I use, interlocking the moments in fiction. And this is what he calls a spatial form. The sense of interconnection, of repetition in the novel. And it doesn't refer specifically to the description of the setting. And then I went to Bakhtin, because I read Joseph Frank's book, and I said, well, that's quite interesting, but that's not exactly what I was looking for. And then I found this with the chronotope, because the chronotope gives me the tools to analyze both realist works and modernist works. And then he talks about the description of the setting of houses and the boarding house and the palaces and etc. And then, so they differ in this aspect, because Joseph Frank is talking about interlocking patterns in the novels, and Bakhtin is talking about the description of time and space in the sense of the representation of the setting. But then, in one of Mikhail Bakhtin's later essays, in his final observations, he argues that the chronotope has many expansions. And that's his final paper on the chronotope. And then I think that he goes towards Joseph Frank's idea. So initially, they're very different. But then in his final remarks, he argues that even the verbal sign itself is a chronotope. So then that's Joseph Frank's idea of the interlocking patterns in fiction. So I think that in his texts on the chronotope, we can see this distinction. But then in his final essay, he argues that there is a chronotopic meaning, that the chronotope makes possible even the production of meaning, that we have chronotope in the sign, the linguistic sign itself. So then that's when they meet in their ideas. So thank you.
Anyone wants to ask Tiago? Obrigada, Thaís.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to thank both of you for those very insightful papers. Tá ligado. For this very for this pair of insightful papers. My first question is to João, but I think that my questions are somewhat related. The first question to João is, how do you factor in to your analysis of Fielding's Joseph Andrews the reality of language itself and the reality of the book, or the materiality of the book, its graphic design? How does the very reality of language, or the very reality of the material support of the book, which more or less conveys the narrative that deals with reality, that represents reality, how does the reality of language and of the book itself stand in the way of our apprehension of the reality that is being configured or actualized by the narrative? And my question is my question to Natasha is, how do you factor into your analysis the temporality of reading, the time we take to read, the duration, and to durée, to use this very Proustian concept, into your analysis? How do you categorize, analyze the time that takes, for instance, for simply for you to sort out, to read, to sort out the meaning of a given longish paragraph, which are so recurrent in James's prose, and how does the notion of durée ends up complicating or shedding light on your mobilization of Bakhtin's chronotope? Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Thiago. Okay, so why do you say Joseph Andrews in particular?
Well,
Você tem que segurar pouquinho. Isso.
Bom, dá para te ouvir. pode ser. Mas é porque está gravando isso? É porque está gravando.
A gente talvez esteja ficando sem bateria. Sim. Deve ser isso.
Thank you. Maybe Joseph Andrews, because you've quoted Joseph Andrews at length during your paper. But we could think, for instance, of Shameless. I'm thinking of the front page of Shameless, which has this famous or rather notorious misspelling of misrepresentation. For instance, which that's PSR, misrepresentation, which is a sort of misspelling that has been retained throughout the novel's successive editions, more or less showing us that language stands in our way to grasp the reality that is being represented through narrative. And Fielding does this. Fielding's novels they foreground the very linguistic dimension of narrative. For instance, with the title of chapters, for instance, with title pages that are constantly signaling to us readers that language is its own self-contained system. That language ought not to be taken as a default window into reality, because we may end up getting bogged down in language itself. I don't know whether I've made myself.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Well, I would say that for Fielding, the use of language is one of the devices of making fictionality explicit. So it somehow contradicts Watts' idea that realism presupposes a exclusively referential use of language, because that's not what Fielding is doing. You know, he's consciously using language and a figurative sense and a poetic sense and in a material sense, as you said about Shemela, as a way of explicitly that that is a fiction, yeah? And this is an integral part of the world-making procedure of the novel. So I think that's it. That's what I would say.
Can I want to get to your question too, but just fill on this. I wonder whether another way in which you might develop this would be to go back to what you're saying earlier about how for Blumenberg, and I think also for the rise of the novel, notions of the autonomy of the individual and freedom are at stake. And as you were asking about Fielding, I was thinking about Blumenberg's hermeneutic and poetic colleague Wolfgang Iser, whom you know is very important to me. And as we've been discussing, Iser's first work was on Henry Fielding. And that was because after the Hitler time, where he was an adolescent, Iser wanted to come into freedom and the Enlightenment and everything that was not Hitler. But interestingly, later in Iser's career, the literary figures that to him represented freedom and possibility and creativity and play were Joyce and Beckett. Now, how do you move from Fielding to Joyce and Beckett? Well, notions of play, freedom, and autonomy, but very different notions of modernity. So this dialogue, I don't think it ever really took place in Constance, but there seems like there's a sort of a dialogue or a debate or a difference between Blumenberg and Iser about how you think about freedom, autonomy, and modernity that would be raised by the opposition between Fielding on the one hand and Beckett and Joyce on the other. I'm sorry, I just had
There's this famous study by João de Azevedo, Joyce's grandfathers, which he discusses Smollett and Stern. He doesn't discuss Fielding. There's this obvious heritage from those anti-realists from the 19th century and the inaugural standard figures of modernism, such as Jim Joyce.
No, I think it.
Okay.
So, Tiago, that's a great question. So you're asking about the temporality of the reading. But I haven't been studying this, but this is great. This is something that I would very much like to do. Because the chronotope itself allows for this exploration. In this final remarks by Bakhtin, he, as I said, he expands the view on the chronotope, and he includes the chronotopes of the reader, of the author, of the represented chronotope in the novel itself. So this is a pathway that is very conducive to studying this that you mentioned, like how the temporality and the spatiality of the reading occurs. What I like to do when I read James is to understand how the narrative at the same time creates a pattern and disrupts it, but not specifically time, but time and space. That's my focus. So, but that would be a great way to go with this temporality and spatiality of reading. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, just thought of something. Maybe the common element between Fielding on one hand or Smollett and Joyce and Beckett would be the self-reflexivity. Right. Yeah.
Connected with comedy and irony.
Yes, exactly.
I think, I'm sorry, can I say something about that? I also think that the 18th century novelists and the 20th century novelists, and even James, the late James, they are not trying so much to disguise fictionality as the 19th century realists like Flaubert or Balzac. They are talking about the fiction as you said, it's as an artifice. So I think both of them, and in the 19th century realists, what Catherine Gallagher says, that the fiction is at the same time disguised but defined explicitly. It's more stable than the 18th century Fielding, or I don't know, Woolf or Joyce or Beckett. That's it.
Sorry. Well, my question is related to Thiago's question, but a little disclaimer, it's from a Marxist point of view. I know Thiago will not approve, but nevertheless, here we are. It's for Natasha. There's a curious thing in the fact that Bakhtin comes from Russia, which is a country that the bourgeois class and the bourgeois experience never crystallized. Yeah, and it's also curious that you use, for example, Balzac, which Lukács will call the bourgeois historian in a kind of way. And it's also curious that James comes from a country, the United States, which difícil falar inglês, né? Formular é difícil. Ainda mais essa hora. Which has a bourgeois class, but not the bourgeois experience. Let's put it that way, like the French. So, in a way, in the Golden Bowl, James is taking the two chronotopes, as you pointed, to reflect that in the heart of the empire, the bourgeois experience are not concluded in a kind of way. If if this is right, if what I'm saying is right, why not think in class terms as well of history and geography?
Just that's related. That's not even like a proper question because
From a Marxist point of view also.
not really, but historical perhaps. There's this excerpt that you chose that Amerigo was walking down the street, and you said about the two empires, the Roman one and the British one. I was thinking that the real empire that embodied this novel is the American one, and Maggie is the embodiment of that. And so just to complicate a little the scheme, so what would be the consequences of this new empire, and so relating also to the talk of Peter Brooks earlier, this of course when he wrote The Golden Bowl, he hadn't visited the United States. Yeah, he was going to, but yes, exactly. But of course he knew something about that, but he didn't have, the impact wasn't there. But
one of the lectures that he gave when he went to the United States was the lesson
of Balzac, exactly. But the version of Balzac by James, that's very, very interesting because it's also geopolitical, and we can discuss about that. Yeah, that's another conversation. But also, so I was just wondering whether this new configuration of the world order would also be something that could be considered in this portrait of the two chronotopes, or the third one that you present in related to the later prose of James. And just to João, that's very interesting. I just knew, I haven't read Blumenberg, so now I'm very curious. But as you described very, very shortly, I just had the same idea that perhaps the later, like the modernism, later James and Conrad, they are walking towards this fourth kind of reality that comes from paradoxes and contradictions, and something that you've talked before as well, Paul. So yeah, that is just to complement the question.
So, Gabriel, that's a great question. And because there isn't time not to say it all here, but your question is pretty much one of the centers of Bakhtin's idea of the chronotope, because he talks about class dimensions, class struggles, what derives from class status. So, for instance, he argues that the chronotope deepens in literature when we have the deepening of class relations, when we have the rise of capitalism, the rise of money relations. That's when we have contradictions in society. That's when we have contradictions in the chronotope. So what you're saying is perfect, because it totally aligns with Bakhtin's theory of the chronotope, because it's totally related to class, the class perspective. And what I see also is that Amerigo's feeling that's a crisis. The narrator describes his feeling as a crisis. And the heart of this crisis is exactly his class position. Just like many other books by James, that the class position, the class situation is the heart of this conversation. So when we're talking about imperialism, and like his what I called his voluntary submission, because it relates to his social ascent. So it has totally to do. So they're very connected, like the class representation and time and space, because Bakhtin sees this relation, that they are very connected. And Marcelo, thank you for your comment and your question, because there is one study by Marjorie Sabin, and then she explores how in the Golden Bowl, James sees the ascent of the United States that will, in a shorter period of time, supplant the British imperialism. And that's the shape of the novel. That's because there is the end of the Roman Empire, the ascent of the British, but by the end of the book, it's the Americans who are ruling. So I think that this movement is exactly this conflict, this conflictuous juxtaposition of the chronotopes. So I think that's how James incorporates formally this geopolitical theme.
And I think one sign that the new empire is not the Roman Empire, neither the English Empire, is that Amerigo becomes a morceau de musée. Yeah, he is in the American city. You know? So, any more questions? No? Also, I think we reached the end of the first day of our conference. I thank you very much. I thank you, everybody here, the audience, and the palestrants, lecturers, sorry. So, thank you very much.